Welcome once again to Heart of a Shepherd. This is the second video devotional for today. It's taken from 1 Samuel chapter 30. Now, the title of this devotional is The Battle and the Victory Belong to the Lord. I invite you to open your Bible with me to 1 Samuel chapter 30. Well, as we return to our study, we find in the first 6 verses of chapter 30 the destruction of Ziklag. Now, David and his men lived in Ziklag for 16 months and prospered while occupying territory controlled by the Philistines. Now, you might remember that David and his men would raid the cities of the Amalekites, and then they would return, and Achish, the king of Philistines, having no idea, he thought David was raiding other cities in Israel. And of course, David, the future king of Israel, certainly was not going to harm his people. Well, as they have been to the battlefront, we find as David has returned home, going home back to his town, that tragedy struck the town of Ziklag when David and his men were absent, joining the Philistine king Achish at the front, in which they were supposed to fight Israel. Well, providentially, the king, because of the general's protest, had sent David and his men back home to Ziklag. Now, the Amalekites, knowing that David and his men had departed with the Philistines to fight Israel, well, they took advantage of their absence, and we read in verses 8 and 9 how they attacked Ziklag, seeking revenge for their raids, the raids of David and his men, on the Amalekite cities. Now, with the men gone, the Amalekites faced no resistance, and they attacked Ziklag, seized the women, children, and sons, and then burned the city. Well, obeying King Achish's order, David and his men left the battle and they headed home. Arriving at Ziklag on the third day, David found that the city had been destroyed, and in verse 3 that the wives and children of his men were gone. With distraught and overcome with grief, David and his men wept until they had no more tears, according to verse 4. However, grief quickly turned to bitterness. David's men began to look for someone to blame, and we read in verse 6 that David was greatly distressed, for the people spake of stoning him. After all, he was the leader. Well, in verse 7 and 8, we have David's consultation with the Lord. Now, David's response to the threats of his men is very instructive, as we see that in David's distress, he, verse 8, encouraged himself in the Lord his God. In other words, he found his strength in the Lord. He then instructed Abiathar. Now, you might remember he is the priest, to bring the ephod, that is the breastplate of the high priest. Afterwards, then, we read that David inquired at the Lord, or of the Lord, and the Lord answered him, "Pursue," verse 8, "for thou, David, shalt surely overtake them, the Amalekites, and without fail recover all." And so verses 9 through 15 now chronicles David's pursuit of the Amalekites. So David obeyed the Lord without hesitation. And we read in verse 9 that his troop of 600 men pursued the Amalekites. Well, exhausted from 3 days of travel from the battlefront and the emotional strain of their families being taken, 200 of the 600 men, we read in verses 9 and 10, grew faint along the way, and they were left behind. However, David continued pursuing their families. While in the path, they came upon an Egyptian slave, verses 11 through 15, whose master, the Amalekites, had abandoned him without food or water. While reviving the man with nourishment, the slave agreed to lead David and his men to the Amalekite camp with the assurance that they would spare his life. Now, consider then verses 16 through 20, David's attack and victory against the Amalekites. And so finding the Amalekites celebrated the spoils they had taken from Ziklag, David and his men attacked them at night. We read, from the twilight, that is from the darkness, even unto the evening setting sun of the next day. So they went from the darkness of one day all the way to the setting of the sun of the next day. And we read, there escaped not a man of them, save 400 young men, which rode upon camels and fled. Verse 17. Now God gave David and his men a glorious victory, and we find in verses 5 and then verse 18 that all that the Amalekites took was recovered, including David's 2 wives. Well, we have an interesting pattern that develops in verses 21 through 31 when David distributes the spoils taken from the Amalekites. And so David took the plunder of the Amalekites for himself, and then he sent some as gifts to the elders of Judah, verses 26 through 31, obviously making sure that he is gaining their favor. After all, they are his tribe. Now, we do read some of the 400 men traveling with David were men of Belial, that is, wicked, worthless, immoral kind of men. Now, we read in verse 22 that they begrudged giving back the possessions of the 200 men who had faltered and stayed behind. Now remember, what they had taken in spoil belonged to the Amalekites, but the rest that they had taken was their own personal property, their family. Now remember the 200 men that had been left behind. And so the thought of returning with the possessions and giving the 200 men their own possessions because they faltered and stayed behind, well, that was protested by the men of Belial, wicked, worthless men. Now, we find, though, in verse 23 that David stepped in, and he reminded those that were complaining against the 200 men that it was the Lord that had given them victory and had saved their wives and children. Well, David's decision in verse 24 and 25 later became Israel's law, reminded the people that the battle and victory belonged to the Lord. Well, with that, we'll conclude today's devotion. Tomorrow, we have the last chapter in our study of 1 Samuel, and I trust that you have been challenged, encouraged, and perhaps implored to do more in your courage of serving the Lord and being faithful to Him. Thank you for being a part of our study. God bless, and bye-bye.